Welcome to Seminary Dropout, interviews with leading theologians, biblical scholars, leaders, and thinkers, asking questions and having conversations that help us better understand God and ourselves. For believers and doubters alike, let's go. My guest today is Dr. Dale Allison. Dale, thanks so much for being on the show.
Happy to be here, Shane.
Well, for those who don't know, why don't you just tell a little bit about yourself, your, where you are in life and your profession and all that good stuff.
Well, I teach at Princeton Theological Seminary, and I am in the Biblical Studies Department. I focus on the New Testament and early Christianity. And within that umbrella, I suppose I focus mostly on the historical Jesus and the Gospels, including especially the Gospel of Matthew. But I'm also very interested in Second Temple Judaism and have actually written commentaries on a couple of Second Temple Jewish texts. Beyond the field of biblical studies, there are other things I do too, just for fun. So once in a while, between heavy academic books, I'll write about something else. So a number of years ago, I wrote a book on George Harrison. I wrote a book on the afterlife and what might lie beyond and our reasons for thinking this or that. My most recent book was actually on religious experience in the modern world, which is sort of my own version, if I'm so bold, my own version of William James's Variety of Religious Experience, updated for the contemporary world. So quite a few things, but most people think of me as doing Jesus, I suppose, and the Gospel of Matthew, because I've written most of the book that I published have been on those two subjects, I suppose.
You're pretty prolific. George Harrison, I did not know about that one. That's pretty cool.
I decided I'd just take a break from academics for a year, and I got to study Hinduism or go back and brush up on my Hinduism. And then I just played George all day long while I was writing every day for a year. And it was a really nice, lovely break. I've always been a George fan. I was a George fan from the beginning, the very beginning. I don't know why. And he remained my favorite Beatle. So a publisher once asked me after he learned about my interest in George, hey, would you like to write a book on George? I said, why not?
Yeah, I mean, look, this is not, I mentioned to you earlier, I'm an elder millennial, so this isn't my generation, but I think anybody who's got appreciation for music has to have an appreciation for the Beatles on some level. But you're right. I mean, you get Paul, everybody loves Paul. Some people like Ringo, and some people like to hate on Ringo, but George Harrison, you don't hear about very much. And is he still around?
No. He died in 2001.
Okay. It's been a while. Yeah.
So he smoked too much and smoked himself into an early grave. But he was the most, if you want, religious of the Beatles. And I'm just a religious person, always been interested in religion. And so that was part of the attraction later on. Paul doesn't do much theology. And John Lennon did a little theology, but it was mostly ill-considered, I think. And George was the most reflective of all four Beatles, in my judgment.
That's fascinating.
The most interesting intellectually, if you will, because he belonged to a religious tradition and tried to think about it.
I'm going to resist my urge to go down that rabbit hole further because there's so much okay. I want to talk to you about. Maybe we'll do another one on George Harrison. So, Dale, for a lot of people like me, especially my generation, who grew up in Christian homes, evangelical, institutions. I grew up reading, like even in junior high and high school, reading books on apologetics that were in the Christian bookstore at the time. And looking back, I don't know quite how to feel about those because at the time they were reassuring. I liked them. It gave me a reason to believe outside of some kind of naive faith.
Hmm.
But as I got older, I looked back at those and I thought, I feel like they were holding something back. I feel like there's some evidence that was probably left out. There's some things were cherry picked. And I feel that I think because the way that they explained it was you almost didn't need faith. Like they were giving you a certainty. And if the evidence led to the kind of certainty they claimed it did, there would be no one in higher education and biblical studies who was not a Christian. You know what I mean? And
Uh-huh.
and so as I've gotten older, my faith has gotten mature. I've sought out, okay, what really is the evidence? The people in the Ivy League and wherever, like what are they looking at that I haven't seen? And this is kind of how I stumbled on to your book. And I felt a real kinship, especially when I was reading um, your book on Jesus and the resurrection of Jesus. That's the title, right?
Uh-huh.
Yeah,
Yep.
probably was that. Would you say it's probably your most successful book, most
Oh, I
well-read
have
book?
no idea how to judge that. It sold fairly well. It's been reprinted. It was reprinted not long after it was published. Became an audiobook. So I guess for an academic book, it's done pretty well. It's not
Yeah,
a bestseller.
yeah,
It's not in Bart Ehrman's league.
but no, well, and yeah, and nothing. Nothing super good's going to be a bestseller. That's a gross over exaggeration, but yeah. So I was reading that, and one of the things, in the intro, you said something like, "You can find me in church on Easter morning," but you are approaching this as a historian, and I think you actually say that the book aims to explore the historical aspects of Jesus' resurrection without taking a definitive position on whether it happened or not.
Huh?
And when I was reading that, I was thinking, I think this is exactly what I've been looking for. Go ahead. You
Yeah.
look like you want to
Okay.
say something to that. Yeah, sorry.
Well, look. So maybe it helps to plug this into my story. So I grew up as a liberal Protestant, a liberal Presbyterian, and in a high school I had this mystical experience which made me want to talk to people about God in ways I had not before. And so I ended up for a brief time in an evangelical church. And I was a smart little kid. And one of the things I did was read this evangelical apologetical literature. And part of the problem for me is that it just didn't convince me. I came away thinking, boy, I wish you had convinced me of this, but I just don't know what to think. I remember reading what is one of the most sophisticated apologists in modern times. So this was a man named Wolfhard Pannenberg, who was a German theologian, and in his Christology, he claimed to show that Jesus rose from the dead. And I remember reading his section of this book that was on the resurrection, and when I finished it, I actually put it down and walked around the room and said, "What did this guy just do? Did he actually do what he claims he did?" And I wasn't sure of this, but that was my response to almost all apologetics. Did this person really do what he or she claimed to do? And so I ended up, in the long run, coming away disappointed from popular apologetical works and decided that the only way to figure things out was to look at things for myself. And I had a choice in college: should I become a philosopher, PhD in philosophy, or should I pursue religious studies? I don't know why I picked religious studies and ended up eventually in Bible. But it was in part because I was not persuaded by what anybody was saying about much. Everybody seemed to be shallow about a lot of things. And so the only option was, I guess I'm going to have to find out for myself.
And here you
And
are.
having worked through evidence on a lot of things, I'm still not sure what to think. I find the world incredibly complex. Everything about the world is difficult, and that includes thinking. That includes every area of life. So the Bible isn't somehow easy and different than everything else. It's difficult. Theology is difficult. There there are no safe intellectual harbors. Everything is up for grabs.
Can I jump in and ask kind of a question out of left field, maybe? But you do call yourself a Christian. You wrote, and we should talk about this a little bit, but your last book was called Encountering Mystery Religious
Uh-huh.
Experience in a Secular Age, where you kind of detail these kind of, some people would call miraculous happenings and things like that. Uh, do you have colleagues when you're at Princeton, or I don't know, you go to SPL or whatever? If you talk to other people, like, do you have people looking at you with suspicion because you are a confessional Christian?
Sure, that's a problem. Um, I should say it's a problem for them. Is a not a problem for me. In part because I recognize that I could be wrong about everything. I don't know what the psychology of this is, but I have no trouble living with uncertainty. I have no problem thinking I might be wrong about most things or even the things that are most important. So all I can do is place my best bet and do what I can. And I realize that there are lots and lots of very smart, well informed people who disagree with me and think I'm naive about things or that I don't understand neuroscience or I haven't taken into account fully modern psychology, and on it goes. Um, so of course I think I'm right about things. How can everybody? But then everybody does. So that's a pretty worthless place to be. So I think eventually you just have to be Socrates and say you don't know anything and you do your best and maybe hope for the best. But I've spent my whole life in history and it's very fragile. Uh, if you're talking about Jesus, early Christians, or you're talking about the origin or resurrection belief, we just have a handful of sources, right? And I just think it's way more difficult than a lot of people think.
Well, that gives me a really good jumping off point to talk about your book on the resurrection. And I do want to talk about Encountering Mystery. So let's save that for a little bit. But
Okay.
I like that you said that, because when I step back, the question that comes to mind is, how do you even start to investigate whether an event that happened 2,000 years ago actually happened or not?
Yeah. Well, it's really, really different. And one of my intellectual heroes is Origen. And Origen, despite being a Christian theologian and a sort of apologist, was upfront and he said one of the hardest things is to show that something has happened, even if it did happen. And so if you put the resurrection to aside for a bit, just think of something else. So there's that story in Mark 5 where Jesus runs into this possessed man and then the pigs run off the cliff, right? Okay. Now maybe that happened. But how can you show that it happened? All you have is one text, really, one text, and then someone who's copying that text. Matthew's copying Mark there. At least I think so. Your one text, it's probably circa 40 years uh, after this event. You can't confirm it with anything, and it's an exceedingly odd story. So, what do you do with it? So, one of the things I'm known for is arguing that when you work with Jesus or try to reconstruct Jesus, the safest place is to look at repeating patterns and themes because it's really hard to authenticate any single saying or single event. And the pigs going off the cliff is one such event. Now, it's conceivable that in the future archaeologists might find a pile of pig bones, below a cliff, and they might say, "Okay, here you go." But you could respond and say, "Well, there was a pile of pig bones there, and someone created this story to explain why the pigs were at the bottom of the cliff." It's endless. So all you have are bets, and you can do your best. But it's really hard with individual sayings or individual events. Now, sometimes you can do this. I think the evidence for Jesus having been crucified is overwhelming. and I'm not a Jesus mythicist. Uh, but unfortunately, most of the things in the Gospels aren't like that. You can't find them in Josephus, and you can't find most of the stuff in Paul, for example. You just have the Gospels,
Yeah.
and the writers know each other or are familiar, I think, with texts that came before them. Matthew, I think, knows Mark. I think John probably has at least heard all three synoptics
Hmm.
before he writes. So you don't have independent witnesses sequestered by a judge, right? And they never talk to each other and so on. Anyway, the point is just to agree with you and to agree with Origin that this is a really hard business.
Yeah. Well, and I think to your point, I think so many moderns, we have a hard time with the Gospels because we are used to modern journalistic historicity when we read things, and we don't understand the literary forms of the day, the ways that people wrote about things back then. So I think that that's hard for us. We've got to put on, first century mindsets, and that's really difficult.
Yeah, so way back when somebody asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up, and I said I want to be a first century Jew. And what I meant by that was I wanted to understand Jesus and the early Christians, and the only way to do that was to immerse myself in those old Jewish sources, which I've tried to do. But you're right. Their conventions, their presuppositions aren't ours. They're just not.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's jump into some stuff. So I've kind of the kind of like, I don't know if I want to say, the stream I'm in right now. One of the things that often would be talked about, say at a Easter service, would be the fact that in Mark, Mary finds Jesus first,
Mhm.
and that in that time the testimony of a woman didn't really count for much, and so this could be seen as some evidence that if you're going to make up a narrative, you don't make up a narrative where a woman is the first one to encounter the risen Jesus. Is there any credence to that idea?
So this is like everything else. Once you examine it, it turns out to be very difficult. So there are texts which show, for example, one of the Dead Sea Scrolls, where a woman can testify against her husband, right? And this is in a formal legal setting. Josephus, on the other hand, says woman's testimony doesn't amount to much. On the other hand, the early Christians uh, are not just men. There are lots of women. There are female missionaries.
Yeah.
There are female leaders. Just look at Paul's letters. So it's not that it's an exclusively male movement where everybody thinks like Josephus does, who can be very prejudicial against women. Now, I do think it is the case that there is a sort of patriarchal or androcentric bias in the Gospels. I think I see it with all four writers. And I do think it's not likely that they would have created a story completely out of nothing in which Mary is the one, or Mary plus someone else discovers the tomb. I think there's something to that argument, but it's not a knockdown proof. It's not easily deployed without talking about all the uh, attendant themes and problems with it. You can't just make a statement, for example, about women's status in Judaism because there were different views, obviously. And then women themselves are going to have different views about women, and there are women who are active in the early church. And so in my most recent book on the resurrection, called The Resurrection of Jesus, I do have a very long chapter on the empty tomb where I look at this argument, but it's probably 10 pages long. And when I come to a conclusion, it's tentative. Yeah, This is there's some weight to this, but that's all you could do in my judgment. So uh, yeah, there's something here, but it's more difficult. You have to be more cautious than people typically are when they deploy this argument.
But I think your summary there was, is it essentially, am I hearing this right, that if you were to concoct a story from scratch, that's to convince people of a narrative, that's probably not the best way to go?
Yeah, so okay, I will say yes to that, and then say, but then I've written a lot which qualifies and
Yeah.
modifies that. But okay, at the end of the day, yes, there's something to that, I think.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, again, part of what drew me to your work was your humble approach. Like, how do you, and I think the answer to my question, how do you decide something happened 2,000 years ago is humbly, right? Modestly.
Yeah, but there's an issue here. So Christianity is controversial. It's always been controversial, so it's always had its opponents. People are always attacking it, and so you understand the apologetical impulse, which is, okay, you think we're wrong. I'm going to prove that we're right. I just think that proving that we're right is way more complex than any book I've ever read on the subject. How about that?
Well, okay. So I was going to kind of save this to the end of the wrap up, but I think we're diving it too heavily, and it gets into, in your book, doesn't the resurrection of Jesus, your book doesn't dive into much theologically, but if you're talking about the
No?
resurrection, you can't help but butt up to a little bit of theology.
Yeah.
and
Uh-huh.
and it's got me thinking about just the nature of faith. And I am a big proponent that doubt is not the opposite of faith, certainty is the opposite of faith. And i don't need I don't need historical certainty that the resurrection happened. And that's good because we can't get it. We can't get it. And I don't mean that I do believe that it happened. I affirm it, but by a lot of Christian apologists, I feel like the idea is that our brain is going to get us 99.5% there, and then throw a little faith on top, and there you go. It's 100%, and you're certain. And I don't need that. I think what I need is to be able to say, is it crazy for me to believe in the resurrection? Like, did I have to check my brain in to believe in the resurrection? And if the answer is no, then that's good. I'm okay with that. I can affirm the resurrection
Uh-huh.
and say, because I think there's Dale, I've found in my life that among Christians there's two ditches, one on either side. And one says, yeah, we can get absolute certainty about this. And it's that, the the brain will get you 99.5% there. You barely need to have any faith, right? And I found that is erroneous. Now the other side says, you just got to believe. Like, forget whatever the evidence is, you just got to believe. And I can't intellectually do that, and it makes no sense to me why the God who gave me a brain would want me to turn it off to believe in him.
So I agree completely with that. And I would say that it's not a question of what we should or should not do theologically. At least speaking of myself, I am full of doubt. I have questions. I'm a modern person. I was given a secular education. I know about the history of religions. I know about other religions. I have really smart friends who are reductionistic materialists. So how can I be confident with the world I live in and the education I've been given? Uh, all I can do is do my best and recognize that this is just really hard stuff,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Uh, but I don't. I think that the people. It's okay. Let me put it this way. I find it hard to think that people who say all you have to have is faith um, have read Kant or Hume. Now Kierkegaard had, and he was into faith, but I'm just not that person.
Yeah.
I'm just not. I just have so many questions. It's like I was handed this faith, and then when I took it out into the world, when I took it out into the post Enlightenment world, when I took it out into my secular world, I was simply bombarded by a million questions. And I'm still trying to answer those questions and figure it out. And it's sort of, this is how the process sort of works in my own mind. I'm handed all these beliefs, and then I spend my life looking at them and say, I don't believe that one anymore. I can still believe this one. I don't know what to make of that one, right? So I'm always sorting through what I was handed. And I think that's what we do with everything. That's part of our education. We go through life and we find out what we were taught correctly or what we were taught incorrectly. I was taught all sorts of things about history that were one sided or biased or turned out to be false and so on. You just go through and you correct. I don't know how you do anything else with your religious tradition. And it would be amazing, wouldn't it, that I just happened to be born into the right tradition that's 100% true? That's just bizarre. It's also the case that most people historically have the religious beliefs they do for the same reason that they have the political beliefs they do, which is parental affiliation.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's just a fact. It's an overwhelming fact. It must mean something.
Yeah, that's right. I find that I have a lot of these people in my life who they grew up in maybe a small town or a rural area, and so yeah, they adopted the political affiliations of their parents. Then, as an adult, they moved to the big city, and then they just adopt the political affiliations of the big city. I'm like, you're doing both the same thing here. Like, you didn't. There wasn't a lot of searching there. But I think, back to this. I think that one of the convictions I have is it can't be true just because we want it to be, and so then we get to say, well, then let's look at the evidence. And I shouldn't be afraid to look at the evidence, whatever that is. We should be able to look at that truth, and then let's make a decision. One thing that I've thought about that makes this kind of thing hard is, in science, you kind of get to start. You kind of get to go backwards, and otherwise, in science, you get to go, hey, the sky appears blue to our eyes. Why is that? And so, but for instance, with the resurrection, you don't get to go, the resurrection absolutely happened. Let's start backwards from that. You have to start at the beginning and say, okay, where's the evidence? And the evidence gets to lead us at whatever the truth is.
Well, so that's how I work. I understand people who live within, let's say, a traditional theological tradition like Roman Catholicism, where they do exactly what you said. But that's not my experience. My experience was I was handed a bunch of religious beliefs, and I came to the conclusion that some of them were wrong, which means that they are up for grab and examination, right? So it hasn't been the case that as I went through life, nothing challenged me, nothing changed my opinion to any significant extent. But my opinions have been changed to a significant extent. So, that's just a fact.
Well,
so
and I
have to live with it.
I don't know about for you, but for me, when I have changed my mind about things, I often discover a more beautiful God. If I can be real theological,
Okay.
So like I was handed a belief of like eternal conscious torment, and started to really look at the testimony of Scripture, and came to a different belief on that. I like this God better, and I don't think that I don't think I was biased. I don't think I just made a different decision and then justified it. Although I guess we're all biased in some ways, but to me, the searching has been really rewarding in that regard. And I get that there are some people for whom that searching has been painful. They've found the truth in a really painful way for whatever reason, because they had their worldview is upended, and that can be uncomfortable at sometimes.
Yeah, well, so I agree with you part of my own story is I was raised as a liberal Presbyterian, and nobody was telling me you have to believe this or you have to believe that. Maybe it was too lax, too laissez-faire, whatever. But I never was part of a system where I felt afraid if I stepped out. Nobody was
Yeah.
telling me if you ask that question, you'll go to hell.
Yeah.
Nobody
Yeah.
said that.
Yep. Yep.
So my wife did grow up as a very conservative Baptist, and she has a very different experience than I do. It's been much, much harder for her to become liberal about some things than me. Heck, I started out liberal about some things, right? Nobody actually told me what I should believe about the Bible in my liberal Presbyterian church. They read it and they told us we should read it. They preached sermons, but they didn't tell us that it was infallible, inerrant. They didn't give us specific doctrines about it. And so I guess I have felt free just to think about it myself. But I know from talking to my wife, it was very different for her.
Yeah. 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 And I still have convictions about the nature of the authority of the Bible, but I still have a lot of freedom there. Like I
Uh-huh.
still, that doesn't mean, so for instance, well, and this will relate to something else about the resurrection stuff. To me, Christianity hinges all on the resurrection. And if the resurrection happened, then that means all manner of things are possible and beautiful and can be made new.
Uh-huh.
If the resurrection didn't happen, and I mean in a historical sense, and with all due respect to people who find a way, the Marcus Borgs of the world, who would call themselves Christians but don't affirm the historical resurrection, it doesn't make much sense to me. I lose it all if the resurrection wasn't true. Now I forgot where I was going with this. We were talking about.
Well, if I don't know where you're going, I don't know how to respond.
No, yeah, right. Um, no, I don't know. I'm not going to get it back, but I think, but one of the what the original thing I wanted to say about that was, oh, I know what I was going to say. If the resurrection's true, then it's okay to me if, for instance, the story about, Jesus walking along and picking up a fish and it pulls a coin out of his mouth. Um, you know, it's all right if that's not historically true. Is if the resurrection's true, then the other thing cannot be true, and that's not really a huge deal to me. You know what I mean? And so,
Yeah.
and I can still have some kind of theology of the authority of Scripture and hold to those things at the same time.
So this gets into very difficult areas that I don't think we want to enter with the time we have left. But
Yes.
I can say this. I sometimes think of my high school algebra class. And the teacher told us that when we found errors in the textbook, we should let the teacher know, and he would send them in to the author or the publisher. And in the next edition, they'd clean it up, right? And he'd been doing this for years. And every year, his students would come up with more errors or more mistakes. Well, from one point of view, that's instructive to me. We still learned algebra. And the students who learned from edition one, which had even more mistakes than my edition did, right? So you can learn all sorts of things, even if your text isn't infallible, even if it's not in error, even if it needs to be corrected. Now, that's a very rough analogy, but it occasionally occurs to me that, yeah, you don't need an infallible book in order to learn math, right?
Mm-hmm.
So why do I need an infallible book to learn religion or to learn Christianity?
Yeah.
But also, I would say that I know of no creed which says, you must believe in Matthew 17 and the story of the coin and Peter and the fish.
Mm-hmm.
So the creeds actually get something right, which is there are some important central things that matter more than others. and
Yeah.
we're going to pick them out and focus on them. So I like that general principle.
Yeah. Yeah. That's good. That's good. I like that too. Okay. So, uh, since we're like blowing through our time here because I'm enjoying this conversation so much. Let's kind of big picture some stuff. I'm curious to know from you, what do you feel like the best evidence is for a historical resurrection?
Okay, so we're going to have to go back to my most recent book. And so what I did is I played devil's advocate. And I said that if you want to be a skeptic and you want to disbelieve, there is a scenario which makes sense and will make sense to you. And we don't need to outline it here, but it involves stealing bodies from tombs, which is an activity we know happens, right? So if I were a skeptic, I wouldn't say the story of the empty tomb is a legend. I'd say it's historical and the body was stolen by thieves and Mary Magdalene found it. And then she and maybe some others had what you would call bereavement visions, and bereavement visions are all hallucinatory, and you could get it started that way. Okay. But I also said that the details of this story have no precise parallel to me, not just in antiquity, but across time. And so to put it in brief, I said, if you want to be a skeptic, you can be a skeptic and keep your mind, your brain. And if you want to believe this, you don't have to leave your brain at the door. You can do this also. But I said, just on plain historical grounds, you're not going to be taught which way to go on this. I think that the historical data has to be configured within a worldview, which involves all sorts of things that history can't give you. It has to do with whether you have any reason to believe in a God or son of God, whether you think that miracles or strange events are possible. It depends on all sorts of things. So this is an anti-apologetical move. Apologetics is here we have history, and on history we can build our foundation and then we can construct Christianity on the basis of this. That's
Mm,
not how I see
mm,
it. I see Christianity as a worldview, a language of discourse, and the resurrection is part of that. And the meaning of it and the reality of it are construed in terms from this larger worldview. So I'm not a foundationalist with regard to the resurrection.
mm.
So that's how I think I would respond to your question. I don't think history can give you what you want or need if you're looking for a worldview. There are so many more things that go into that. And it's your worldview that's actually going to interpret the historical data for you or tell you what you should think rather than the other way around.
Sure. Yeah. I don't disagree with that. At the same time, I think, for instance, if you had said, and if other scholars had said, in a Jewish worldview, first century Jewish worldview, it would be perfectly consistent to say, for people to say, for Jesus followers to say, he rose from the dead and mean that in a metaphorical sense. You know,
Okay, so I don't see any evidence for Jews using resurrection that way with stories like Mark 16 or John 21 or John 20. I don't see that. So maybe resurrection in Ezekiel 37 is a metaphor for natural restoration,
mhm.
but that passage is also given a very literal understanding later on by Jews. And I think the view that you have in the Talmud, which is that resurrection involves bones and the Mount of Olives splitting in half and bodies coming out and so on. I think there was a lot of literalism back then. So that's my own historical uh, take on this. But going back to what I was trying to say earlier and worldview, you have to think of this. If you're a modern apologist, and you're trying to show Jesus rose from the dead or that God raised Jesus from the dead, that's very different than Peter in Acts 2 and 3. In Acts 2 and 3, Peter is speaking to a Jewish audience. They believe in God. They believe in miracles. They believe in a Messiah or a Messianic son of David. They believe in a resurrection of the dead. They already have these categories.
Mhm.
And that's what makes it possible to speak like this. If you have none of those categories and you have the same historical facts, they're not going to be construed the same way.
Yeah, yeah. So I guess my point is, if you say, if we look at the evidence and we say we don't really think that the early followers believed in a literal resurrection, that wouldn't disprove a literal resurrection, but it's pretty damning, I think. But
I don't think they did.
No, that's what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying. Like, if you had gone through and said all those things, and like, if it makes it incredibly uphill battle to believe in a literal resurrection, then we could follow that, right? But I think the word that keeps coming to mind is plausibility. That, and what you said, we don't have to check our brains in the door to believe in the resurrection, and that's all my faith needs, is to get that far, to not say no, this is preposterous. And I love, one of the habits you have is to put yourself in the frame of mind of the skeptic. And I don't blame skeptics one bit for starting backwards, for going, well, what we know is people don't raise from the dead. So then let's construct that narrative that gets us to fit these facts that would work. I don't blame them at all for doing that. That's perfectly reasonable, I think.
Yeah, the other thing you have to think about is that people who are trying to prove that Jesus rose from the dead want him to have risen from the dead and want this to vindicate their religion. And often it's the case that people who are taking the time to construct arguments against Jesus rising from the dead have their own agenda.
Yeah.
And often it's very understandable. People who were raised in fundamentalist churches that they now hate, people who have seen all the bad things and damage that religion does, all the nonsense that. So I'm a religious person, but I'm perfectly willing to observe the obvious, that religion is not always and everywhere good for people. It hasn't been. There are horrible things associated with the history of Christianity. There are things about current Christianity that make me cringe, and so on and so on and so on. So I understand somebody who says, heck, I don't want this guy to rise from the dead. That'd be terrible.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Well, in the time that we have left, tell me a little bit about encountering mystery. So my understanding is you cataloged all these kind of mystical events and worked them out, discuss them. And some fit into a perhaps traditional Christian worldview, and some don't.
Yeah. So I'm doing three things in this book. First of all, this is not a cutting edge academic treatise. I think of it as sort of journalism. So if you go through the right sources, do the right sort of research, you realize that many things you think of as rare are really common. Mm-hmm. Really common. It's just that we have a sort of censorship within society and within churches that don't allow people to speak up. So in this book, I report on how common it is for people to run into ostensibly evil spirits or wicked forces or satanic oppressive powers and so on. Secular people who have no religious inclinations at all. I also show how common mystical, transcendent experiences are, how common it is for people to run into some force or to think they've run into some force that is loving and compassionate and overwhelming, and they end up thinking that's what reality is all about, right? I've looked at experiences surrounding deathbeds, not just near-death experiences, but visions at deathbeds and so on. So what I'm doing here is just say look at these experiences. When you look into them, they are everywhere. People are having them, whether they're religious or not, whether they fit into a theological program or not. That's the first thing the book does. Second thing the book does is it tries to argue that if you are otherwise a normal person and you have a vision or think you've seen an angel or whatnot, that's no reason to be pathologized. That is, people
Yeah.
who are otherwise normal, if they have extraordinary experiences, that's no reason to say something wrong with you. Okay, so I am very personally involved in this. I've had visions. Every member of my immediate family has had visions. They've been really important and meaningful to us. We're highly educated, rational people, and we're not mentally ill. There's not anything wrong with us. All right. So people need to recognize not only that certain things happen way more often than they think, but they're not indicative of psychological pathology. The third thing I do in this book is argue that some of these experiences may well push back against the sort of reductive, materialistic framework. Some
Yeah.
of them do. So, those are the three things I'm trying to do in this book. And it does take me to territory I've not been in before. And I wouldn't have written it 30 years ago. I wouldn't have written it 20 years ago. I wouldn't have written it 15 years ago. But I'm at the end of my career. I no longer care what people think, so I can be honest. And so this book is a sort of, okay, this is what I've really thought all along, but I wanted to get promotion and tenure and have the respect of people in the field. Now I don't care if I get respected or not. I've already made my contributions, to my field. So here's what I really think.
You're the Trojan horse of Princeton, is what I'm hearing.
Well, I don't know about that.
That's
Uh,
hilarious. No,
but I do have a strange worldview, and it exists apart from my Christian theology. In other words, I personally think, maybe I'm wrong. I need to be humble. I personally think that apart from Christianity, the Bible, my theological tradition, people sometimes see the future. I think clairvoyance is real. I think some visions are ex- they're not just internally generated. They're not just hallucinations.
sure.
I think there's something really interesting going on with many near death experiences and so on. So I have a strange worldview which exists apart from my Christian orientation. And my approach in this book is just to be empirical and to say, look at what's happening to people, not just in Christian circles, where this is also cross temporal. That is, I'm looking at experiences that you can document down through the centuries in different places and saying, what do we make of them?
Yeah. I there's part of me that really loves that stuff, and honestly kind of feels like Christians should be the ones kind of more investigating that stuff, um, because I feel like, oh, there's been too much of a myopic view within Christianity. And for instance, a lot of times when people see their dead relatives, a lot of times in conservative Christianity, the go-to move is, no, that can't happen because they're either in heaven or hell,
Yeah.
and so that must have been demonic. And I don't know that move is necessary. I don't know, and I think
Uh,
that sometimes, look, I love and appreciate Christian theology, but a lot of times what Christian theology does is it says, okay, from Scripture we're given this one puzzle piece, and that's all that Scripture gives us. And what Christian theology often does is it says, okay, here's the puzzle piece. Here's what that next puzzle piece that would go into that puzzle piece should look like to fit into it. And that's fine, but often we become way too dogmatic about that part of it. And I just find that unnecessary. Now, and I also feel like, okay, if we're Christians, if we believe in the good and evil, and if there's some kind of spiritual demonic realm, I feel like the test of that would be, okay, when you saw that loved one, did it bring damage and destruction into your life?
Mhm.
I don't know, did that apparition tell you to hurt yourself or something like that? Or did it bring you comfort? Did you feel love
Yeah.
from that? I don't have a way to make uh, Satan an arbiter of bringing love and comfort into someone's life.
No, so I understand that argument and I agree with it, but I would go further. You said it's unnecessary to invoke demonic explanation for certain things. I think it's often terrible. It's not just unnecessary, but terrible. And you can invoke Satan for anything you disagree with, anything you hate, and you can't confirm the argument. It's just a unverifiable assertion, right? So this is one of those things Karl Popper speaks to. What good is this empty assertion for which there is no evidence pro or con? It's just your assertion. It's demonic because I don't like it. That's not an argument.
Yes.
But you are right about evangelical Protestants in that if you look at opinion polls, they are the group that report the fewest paranormal,
Mm-hmm.
unusual, strange experiences. And I am certain it's not a reflection of their experience, it's a reflection of what they feel comfortable to report. So, right after the Reformation, Protestants decided that when you were dead, you were in heaven or hell. So, Protestants didn't know what to do with ghosts, right? Roman Catholics could say, "Oh, well, that's so and so in purgatory. We can fit ghosts into our scheme." But Protestants said you can't see ghosts anymore. So the Protestants said, if you see a ghost, it's either a demon or you're hallucinating. There's something wrong with you. So lo and behold, Protestants start reporting a lot fewer ghost stories because who wants to say I'm possessed by a demon or
I'm a
hallucinating, right?
heretic. Yeah.
But Roman Catholics, they can still report these. I've run across old sermons within the first few decades of the Reformation where Protestants say, "Hey, nobody in our neck of the woods sees ghosts anymore." I know better. They're still saying ghosts. They're not reporting them. That's what's going on.
I find all of that so fascinating. You tell a story in the book, or you recount like a study that some group did where they were going to people who had lost loved ones and saying, have you seen them?
Oh
Have you had
yeah,
apparition? And like only like one out of, I don't know, hundreds said yes, and they were kind of confused, and so they go back and they say, a perfectly reasonable person can have it doesn't mean you're crazy. It
yeah.
doesn't mean, and then all of a sudden they're like, okay. And then there's all these other experiences all of a sudden.
So that particular study, 2% of the people involved said yes. I've been in contact with my dead spouse. After they went back and said, this doesn't mean you're mentally ill, and so on and so on, it went to 50%. So that's just a terribly revealing fact about modern life and what we know about the world. If you phrase questions in the right way or convince people that you're open minded, you get the stories. If they think you're not open minded, you do not get the stories. So I get lots of stories. Other people don't get any stories.
Yeah. Yeah. That's so fascinating. I love it. I love it. Okay. Well, Dr. Allison, this has been such a treat for me. Thank you for your work, your scholarship. I have to say, the research you did for the resurrection of Jesus is mind boggling because every page is like a third citations. You really get your page count up that way.
Well, I wasn't trying to get my page
I know. I'm
count
giving you a hard
up.
time, but it was
It's
impressive.
just it's just that this topic has fascinated me for so long. So I've tried to read as much as I can. That's it. I'm actually unhappy with the book because the print's too small. I don't like it.
Oh,
I wish they'd made the book longer, but then it would cost more, and that's what the publishers are all about.
they can charge more then. Come on.
Well, I'm not in charge of that part of the business. I write the book, and then it's out of my hands.
Well, Dr. Allison, it's been a pleasure. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks. Enjoyed speaking with you.
That's all for today, friends. I hope you found something helpful. Remember to rate and review the podcast wherever you listen to it. You can support Seminary Dropout by going to supportseminarydropout.com. Remember, all past episodes, 200 plus of them, can be found at seminarydropout.com. You can find me on almost all social media channels. My handle is ThatShaneB. All right, friends, I'll see you next time.